morning, everybody. I think I can see people in the distance just coming in. Welcome, everybody, to day 3 of our Celtic Art Conference here in the St. Patrick Centre. I hope you're all enjoying it. We had a wonderful dinner here last night, and thanks to all of the staff who looked after us. And we had also then a great music night in Denver's. With the Higgins family, thanks to them, and thanks to Denver's, and particularly Stephen McGorian at Denver's, who did put on a great show for us. So I know you're all based, many of you are based in Denver's, and they've really looked after us. So just also, for those of you who maybe have just arrived for the first day, perhaps you're joining us today, welcome. And to remind you also that there's a gallery of art by many of the artists, probably all of the artists here, just round to the right as you go out of the gallery. Just keep going right. I go right sometimes too soon and I end up in a little book alcove. But it's just round to the right there, and there's some fantastic art on display, and you can talk to the artists, and some of it's available, so have a chat to them if you're interested. And also, Aidan Breen's Ulysses Tower, which he was talking about to us on Thursday, is on show in Down Jewellers, which is in the square. So as you go out of the centre, there's the St. Patrick Square, and on the left, in the row of shops, is Down Jewellers, and in the window is this amazing Ulysses Tower that Aidan was telling us about. So you can see that there today. Have a look at it, and thanks to Coleman McGuinness of Down Jewellers for displaying it for us. It was a perfect location. Also, there's a lovely display of silver jewellery and all kinds of things, some by Aidan and also Stephen Walker of Walker Metalsmiths, who's going to talk to us later on, and his apprentice Sydney Gallo, and that's her apprentice work. She's now fully qualified jeweller. So thank you, Sydney, for bringing your work, and congratulations. So you can see that work in the foyer. Actually, it's just opposite the reception area, the case on the left and the top 3 shelves. And there's also a few things by William Scotty McRae, who was Stephen's mentor, really. So it's lovely to have those things brought over the Atlantic to show us. And in the foyer you can also see Nicola Dixon's banners hanging there welcoming us. We've got some great photos of Nicola yesterday with matching dress. Fantastic. I also want to just point out that there's a conference t-shirt. Please buy one. They're just wonderful things. Thanks to Ed Rooney for making the logo. And you know, he made the one for the first conference in 2019 as well. So these are available. You can have a look at them outside. And if you'd like one, just go along to the reception and pay for it there. So they're lovely. And you know, since you're here, you really need to mark the occasion, I think. I also omitted to point out when you were at the cathedral yesterday, thanks to the cathedral for putting on a lovely tour for us. And Clive Schooler was giving us a tour of the cathedral, and we had a look at St. Patrick's grave and the cross. Now, unbeknownst to me, they did actually go ahead and produce a little model of St. Patrick's cross. There we are. So it's a tiny model with amazing detail in resin. And I meant to point this out to you when we were up there. But they're up there for sale if you'd like one. If you'd like to take a little memento of St. Patrick's town, they're up there. So I also wanted to mention that we have a great afternoon session this afternoon all kinds of things happening after lunch and after Cynthia has given us her talk about key pattern. So we have Ed Rooney. It says in the program that he'll be in here, but in fact he'll be in the gallery, showing you how to do his vector-based Celtic art. And Murray Heisman will be showing you his Celtic games, which are fascinating. And also Jeff Fitzpatrick Adams will be doing a wood carving demonstration. And then Michael Carroll will also be in the area where we have our lunch. So we have coffee in the gallery, which is just around there. But then we have lunch in the area at the back of the cafe. So it's up the stairs and right to the end. So we're having lunch there. But I think it's about 2:50. Michael will be setting up, Michael Carroll, who gave us a great talk about key pattern, the history of key pattern yesterday. He'll be doing a workshop on how to make it yourself. So if you'd like to go along, you can sit and he'll show you on the big screen how he's doing it, and you can all have a go. I did this in Andover 4 years ago and had great fun. And it's really wonderful seeing how you can create this pattern from his special grid. So have a look at the program. You can see the times. But the great opportunity is to meet the artists in the gallery and then get involved and chat to people and have a go. Then the trip tomorrow, I hope you're coming. There are a few free places, but you need to tell me. Sorry to hear that one or two can't go. But the important thing is that the bus is going at 10 o'clock from the exit, or the entrance to the centre here. So please be here at 9:45 or 9:50, because we might have to go in order to keep to our timeline of seeing Struel Wells, Saul Church, St Tassock's or Hope, and then up to Nendrum, a bit of a ride to Nendrum after lunch. We're going to have a bit of a soup and sandwich stop in Paddy's barn. So Paddy is feeding us at lunchtime. Nendrum and then Inch Abbey. I also need to know if you're going tomorrow, if you'd like to, lunch isn't included, but if you'd like to have soup and a sandwich, I need to know what kind of sandwich you want. So there is a choice, and I'm going to have to send around a list for you during the day, if you can decide if you're going to do that. But we're going to have all the benches outside. Hopefully it's not going to be pouring with rain. We don't want those storm clouds coming. We've done really well so far. So St Patrick's been on our side. So tell me if you desperately want to come, and tell me what sandwich you want during the day. So that's all the admin, I think. But welcome to the third day, and day 4 will be also very exciting, and hope you can come on the tour. So this morning we have 4 great talks, and first of all, Thomas Keyes is going to be talking to us. He's an insular illuminator and parchment maker based in Cromarty on the Black Isle, and that's one of my favourite places. It's got so many sculptured stones, that area. And he's originally from Northern Ireland, so he's come back to see us. And he began as a letter art graffiti writer, and then really moved into calligraphy, making original art based on original manuscripts. He produces manuscripts for museums and works with academics on ancient techniques for making parchment and pigments in particular. And he's currently working on a book of Gaelic origin legends for the Tarbert Discovery Centre. So Port Mahomet is a great site, and the centre tells its story. And he's working with scholar Dr. Michael Newton. So his talk is on making the Book of Kells. I think he's going to make one for us now. Thank you, Thomas.
So I've hyped it up a bit with that title, but as far as we can get to the Book of Kells in 25 minutes. So I'm going to go through mainly the parchment, because that's the bit that doesn't get talked about a lot. Go a little bit on the pigments, and a wee bit fragile from last night, so I'll probably go quite easy on the geometry. But the new information came in Denver, so it's actually it's a better talk. I have to change it a bit now, because it was a medieval cattle expert. So this is the sort of what you're facing with insular parchment. The problem is the variables. All modern parchment is either made inside or in very hot countries, and it's just not the same conditions. So insular parchment, you know, every book's different. Within a book, there's great variety, and it's very hard to pin down what's going on. And scholars often describe it as, you know, it's like a bit of a mess. They'll say that the spine alignment's as if, you know, it's all over the place. It's not consistent, and there's holes in it. And the sort of act is as if the Irish didn't care. But it's really quite the opposite. It's the conditions they're dealing with are very, very complex, and it's quite incredible that they were able to get such consistency under those conditions. A lot of the things that are said about parchment by modern scholars just aren't true. And a lot of the more outlandish things that are said from the early medieval period that seem completely mad are true. So we'll get rid of some of these first. There's not injuries to the animal before it's killed. That's just not a thing. There's not even one bruise in a medieval book, and you do get bruising on animals. That survives through the parchment process, and you can get that in modern animals. They're accused of having low quality hides. Again, that's not a thing with Irish cattle then or now. From the skinning process, you never put a knife anywhere near a bit that would be used for making parchment, and then a lot of little pockmark holes have been misidentified as warble fly. Now, a warble fly will only come out the skin of the animal at about 8 months old, which is long after the age it would be useful for parchment. And if they use an older animal, it would have this sort of scar pattern here. So this is one I've done with warble fly, but again, that's completely absent in the original material. And also you can see the bruising there. So if there was bruising, it would look like that little mark in the center there. But again, you just don't get that in the originals. From research that was going on to about 1 o'clock this morning, I've realised that this slide's actually wrong. This is the wrong calf, and that's why. Because there's always a dilemma, should you still be in the pub at 1 in the morning if you're talking at 10 in the morning? But it turned definitely yes, basically. Got absolute gold from the medieval cattle expert, Tom. So I've actually forgotten the name of the breed, but I was always thinking it was Kerrys and Dexters they were using, because a lot of the hair follicle patterns left in cows are black. But that's because black hair is really, really difficult to get out, whereas white hair follicles come out. But I thought they'd found a way to get the black hair follicles out, but it turns out they hadn't. It turns out they actually had loads of white cows. They're not rare, whereas these days it would be maybe 3-4% of what you get in would be white. But it turns out there was a breed that they had, there was loads of them, about 20% of them were coming out pure white. So basically there was loads of white cows, it was never a problem, and that's just made my life considerably easier in many ways. So that's what you start with, you have to pretend that's a white calf. I've tastefully edited out the middle picture, but you can see there's the final result of that, and that's the only holes you're really putting through the hide. You're putting a stake through the back legs and the tendons to hang it up for skinning. And then again, I've skipped out a few bits just because it's a bit early in the morning for all that, but that's the skin, and these are the other bits you would get off the animal that are of use. So that's the cannon bones to make pegs from, and tendons. So the sinews out of the tendons are what you'd probably use for sewing, because that gels with the skin really nicely, and possibly for stretching, although the tendons aren't great if they get wet, so it's not clear, but they're good string. And then there's obviously other bits of the animal go off for other uses. So a lot of early medieval manuscripts come with quite dramatic stories about what happened to them that seem like quite outlandish claims about how they've got their damage or their holes, or something's happened to them and they still don't appear to be damaged. And these are often dismissed as things that just couldn't have happened. So this is the book that was martyred with, St. Boniface was martyred with. So he was attacked by the pagans, allegedly held up the book to defend himself, and that is sword blow damage. And I'm going to probably go for something quite Northumbrian actually. So if you use Kells parchment, it's already got wee holes. So the good thing about, yeah, that's like a Northumbrian kind of style and Kippet page. The good thing about Northumbrian parchment as a control is it's got no holes in it. So you can see now it's not got any holes in it. And I don't have a sword obviously, so I'm not going to start whacking manuscripts with a sword, because that'll be a bit much. But if I can just fit it in here, because it can fold, it's not a problem for it. But I do have an axe to use for quite a lot of things. I see it's not the worst, like just not the worst. And it's still going to keep itself as a book, it's still going to keep itself as a page, it just isn't that big a deal. And when you hear about these mad things happening to manuscripts, it's really it's tough stuff, and this was just one folio. We're talking, if you've got 50, 60 folios together, you could defend yourself like that. I mean, you really, it's not delicate stuff. You can keep going at that for quite a while, and this page is going to take some abuse. Another thing that comes up, well, I've gone ahead too much, is water damage. And if you read the lives of the saints, it's almost as if they can't get across the river without their book satchel dropping, and the book landed in the river, and it's there for months. And then somebody finds it, and even with Stephen's talk yesterday, tracking down the work of O'Connell, you see Irish parchment, he's already onto the water damaged ones. It's like no Irish parchmenter, it seems, can make anything without it eventually ending up in water. So they must have, this must be built in. If you're making parchment the insular style, I mean, you have to expect that it's going to get wet at some point. It could be mad otherwise, because it always seems to. And you can see, it's not that big a deal. The inks are fine, everything. It just isn't really much of a problem. So Durrow was completely submerged for quite some time, and many books apparently were. And now, obviously, that's just fresh water. Fresh water, it's not that big a deal, whereas salt water, that should be proper damage. And Lindisfarne Gospels, again, lost over the side of a boat, washed up on the shore, in salt water, but it's under the protection of St. Cuthbert. Sort of a bit of wave action. But because it's Northumbrian parchment, it's got divine protection. So it'll miraculously just be like that. There we go, it's all nice and flat. I'll clamp that later. By tomorrow afternoon, that could be in the gift shop, and you wouldn't know a thing about it. And that's really most of the myths about parchment. It is tough stuff, and it's very difficult to cause it a problem, which makes it more interesting when you do get holes in parchment. What are they about? So pretty much every hole that's in a parchment is a trade-off in a production technique, and it can be identified. Now, these are ones that are very common. They're almost the kind of white noise of holes that, particularly in this country, you've either got too much water or too little water. So when you're rinsing your skins and there's too much rain in a natural water course, it chucks up grit, the grit gets in the hair, and then when you do it over the flesh and being, you hit a bit of grit, and that's what causes your hole, that tears the skin. So every manuscript, even Lindisfarne's, got a little bit of that in it, and they're not that diagnostic, they're not that helpful, because it affects everybody. If you've got too little water, you end up agitating the skins, and then the grit that got in your system, when there's too much water, gets agitated, and that gets into the skin, so there's no way to avoid it. These holes are much more interesting because they're very specific. These are very diagnostic of an exact thing that happened in an exact way. So the way that hole's quite elongated, that means that skin was stretched and dried, then it was wet again. So you can be very specific about that, because if that was just, as you saw with the grit holes, they were round, that's because that skin, when it was tensioned, it had never been dried before, so the hole opens the whole way up. Whereas here, that's already had a stretch, and the fibres have already meshed in such a way that there's not much give left in it. And the fact that it's rounded towards the top, and that's the original from Kells, so that means that you can tell that some fellow was pouring water onto that hide, the top of it got wet, and this was like the first pour, but the corium layer underneath, it still hadn't soaked through at the bottom, so that's why it's a tear. So that's almost wet to dry. You can be very specific about that, and you can be specific about it was this tool that made it. It has to be a tool this size to get that surface area and that pressure. And this is an exact replica of the lunellum found at Port Mahomack, the only example of such a thing. And that's that hole in the Book of Kells, and that's one of several in the Book of Kells. There's about maybe up to 10. Some are less clear, but there's another one in the Book of Kells. You can see even their holes are neater than mine. It's absolutely perfect. Even if they make a mistake, that's an expert mistake. I would say that was probably a little problem here. Maybe a bacterial hole has caused a little bit of an imperfection in the skin. So they've actually gone in with the right pressure, but because there was a flaw in the skin, that's caused the hole. But you can just see the stroke, how smooth that is. I mean, that's absolute expert. And with all through the Book of Kells, I mean, that happens less than 10 times. So that's very, very good. And you can see my attempts at making a similar hole again. It's this tool, and it's hot water being on the skin, scraping off the grain, very, very specific to Kells, and this tool, of which there is only one example. And that's the toolkit from Tarbet. That's the original lunellum. I got the measurements of that to a blacksmith to make this, so it's exactly the same thing. They're using bone pegs, which I'll get into in a minute, because they're their own rabbit hole. And they're using the pebbles to tie onto the side of the skin, the pumice rubbers, And that's your parchment making kit. So that's an outline of a normal size linellum. That's what they're supposed to be like. That's modern parchment making. So it's basically a completely different tool. It operates completely differently. All right, bone pegs versus wooden pegs. Basically, wooden pegs, you can knock them out in a couple of minutes. It's really easy. They're seasoned woods. You can do them whenever you like. Bone is an absolute nightmare. It is 10 times the work. You see that looks, you stick out on Instagram, it looks nice, you do a wee workshop, whenever you go, that's a nice day out, isn't that lovely? This is an absolute nightmare. You need 10 cattle per frame, so that's 40 feet. Cutting, deboning cow feet is very, very difficult. I mean, very unpleasant, and sort of every bit of blood and goo and everything that comes out of a cow seems to stick to its feet, and then it sticks to you, and then you're covered in it, and and you have to do it in November because it would be the Martinmas slaughter when they're 2 years old, so it's freezing, and they're greasy, and it's so much more work than wooden pegs. And at Tarbert, they go for bone pegs exclusively, so there must be a very, very good reason. This is the macerating pit, so after you've boned them, they're all greasy, you've got to bury them with seaweed, and this pit was found at Tarbert with winkle shells at the bottom and some dog whelks, but they're only there because they're falling off the seaweed, whereas you keep taking the bones out and putting more seaweed in, so it's been misread, that hole, that they're doing that for the alkaline. But if you were trying to get your alkaline from dog whelks, I mean, you'd be there for 100 years to do one skin. You'd be getting a bucket load every week or something. It's nowhere near efficient, but as a maceration pit, that's how that makes sense. That's carving the bone peg. That's with this axe. It wrecks your blades as well. You've got to resharpen constantly. So it's a real bit of work for a peg that is actually it doesn't actually last that long. It's not like it's stronger, because you have to carve in on a weak point to where the string goes, and you keep stretching on that point, and then you keep getting hot water on it. So a lot of the pegs at Tarbert are broken, so you have to keep remaking them. But they come into their own, and it's one specific bit. I don't know if I'll get this in long enough to make it work, but basically, they're more evidence that the skin is soaked after it's dried, because the only way these pegs make sense is that wooden pegs get stuck, but bone pegs still turn. So that's why they went all that effort, is for that second stretch, which again brings you back to the holes that are in kells, that is specifically parchment that's been stretched twice. And you can absolutely guarantee that at Tarbert, and you can absolutely guarantee it in kells, because it's so much more effort to do that, but it gives you this return. And this is, how do I play video on this? Because that is video, but I don't know what button to press. So this is the Tarbert method happening. So I'm chucking hot water on it, going down, and you see it's more like a wallpaper scraper. Now if you saw traditional parchment paper, they go, have you sped that up or something? Because that's me doing, 2-3 hours work in about 5 minutes, because you're scraping it off. Instead of just abrading that by brute force down, you're delaminating it. The hot water is separating the layers. So the Tarbert technique is miles more efficient than any modern technique that we have. And again, that wear pattern, that way of doing it, the long elongated holes, when you get it wrong, that's what happens. That's what they're doing in kells. It's exactly the same thing. This is the second type of hole that's in kells, and it's absolutely riddled with it. And these are bacterial holes. And kells is probably the best example of bacterial parchment. It just shows, it looks like a book that was made in one place with this method. And the reason they're going for bacteria, if you look at the geological map of Britain, a Northumbrian manuscript from Lindisfarne, they're sitting on a big pile of limestone. So they don't need to innovate. They've got control of that variable. They can make really strong lime, really cheaply. Chuck the skins in that and you're fine. At Tarbert, obviously, as far as you can possibly get in the UK, other than Cornwall, from a good source of limestone, so they're really having to innovate. And this is the comparison of the two materials. They're using seaweed. So you burn seaweed, it sort of becomes its own fuel, which is quite nice, but other than that, madly inefficient. And that's your sort of rate of return. So you get 74% return nitrated lime, 2.5% for seaweed. So that makes Lindisfarne 30 times more efficient than Tarbert. That doesn't make sense. Even in medieval times, nobody's going to put up with that rate of inefficiency. So even though you could probably bring it down to maybe just 15 times more inefficient, because limestone you need to keep adding fuel to burn it. So there's things like that, but it's still by magnitudes more inefficient. And these are other options that do get put about sometimes. Again, bones, they're absolute nightmare, and you don't actually get as much as you think. They're less than 40%. Shells are just tiny, so the amount you need to collect, and then you deplete the resource that's in front of you, you'd have to move further. So again, you do get the chemical, but when you try to apply it in reality, it just doesn't make sense. So this is the bacterial process in kells, and you see that's an all right kells page. Now this skin came out 20 minutes different to that one. That's your time window for making a mistake. So they obviously are a lot better at it than I am, and probably it's some way of turning the bacteria off, which I don't understand, but their control of it in Kells, the fact that they only take it to that level and never really any further, or there was a big mistake pile that never made it. It could have been this, terrible book with Kells. Maybe every other book in the monastery was just like Swiss cheese, but they didn't survive. But basically, it's a very, very difficult process to master, and Kells is an example of it being done extremely well. This is a kind of in process, that's it arrested, and this is one now sort of high summer parchment where you've got the bacteria really going for it. They actually degrain the skin themselves, so you would get a short season, maybe for a month or two, if you can keep control of it. Where the parchment's almost making itself, you take it out and you don't even have to use linolene. That's the grain literally just peeling away itself. And some of the pages in Kells look like they had control of that technique as well, which is incredibly complex. I can't make a whole skin do that and stay together, but it looks like they could. This is the spine alignment in Kells, and the reason that some along the side, some along the top, and it's been accused that they're just haphazard and they don't care. But really what it is, if you see when you're cutting it on the hearse, they're just avoiding the holes because they're making bacterial parts and they're doing the most efficient cuts. So it's quite a simple reason that they're just moving things around and getting their best cut of parchment, which again takes it back to being bacterial and what's going on at Tarbet. And to prove that the parchment maker and the artists of Kells are, if not the same people, very closely related, on almost every page in Kells that's got holes, you can see that the text misses the holes. Now, if you just had 9 darts and you threw it at that, what are the chances that you'd miss all the text? Whereas these are randomly distributed holes. And on almost every page of Kells, the text misses them. And that's because, again, they're actually, I think, marking the text out before the folio has been cut. So it's on the hearse, they've probably got something like a little stringed grid, and they're actually holding it up like that and finding the best optimal cut while the skin's still on the hearse. So it puts the parchment making process and the artists in the same place. So we'll get on to pigments now. And I won't go into detail on all of these. Orpiment's the sort of most boring one because it just has to be imported. They got it from Spain somehow, so we rocket turns up, and that's that. Woad is quite interesting. It's probably the most interesting. They can grow that locally. Oak bark ink, that's just ferrous sulfate, which is produced by bacteria, and oak bark that you collect in spring when the tannin content's cracked. Verdigris, just vinegar and copper. Gypsum, again, naturally occurring. Lead, which they only use the lead tetroxide, and that shows very advanced chemistry because that only works between 420 and 470 degrees, I think it is. So in medieval times, how do you control that temperature? But again, at Tarbet, they've got lead working, they've got glass making, they found some of the yellow lead, so it proves that process, which is very complex to master, was there on site at the right time. And the final one is the lichen purple, which is quite simple. It just ammonia and lichen, and just leave it for 3-4 months. It's a little grey blob and eventually goes bright purple. It's quite a satisfying experience. Again, with pigments, when we don't really know what's going on, it's about efficiency. So this is, for a long time it was thought it was the Tyrian purple, was in manuscripts. But basically if you spend 5 minutes trying to, I think it's what it's called, milking dog whelk, so it's quite a difficult thing. You have to often kill the whelk, and you've basically got a tiny little gland that makes a tiny little bit of pigment. And after about 10-15 minutes work, that's what you're getting, and you don't really have much control of it. The same amount of work, you're getting all that pigment of Orson, and that'll colour the Book of Kells 3 times over. So it's just massively, massively more efficient, even though both the purples are there, but they just go for the easy option every time. So that's those. Woad, which seems easy. Trinity did the research, they did the ramming on it, said it's woad and gypsum or something like gypsum. And you think, well, how difficult can that be? And that's 24 perfectly reasonable options without taking into account ratios, temperatures, all the rest. You could make 1,000 options that are all perfectly reasonable and match the science. And the problem is there's only really one of them that actually works. It took quite a while to find it. So I got the idea from it from Mayan Blue, where they heat up a clay with their local indigo source, and it gives a very, very similar blue to what's in Kells. So I worked on that with gypsum for some time. And that's this process in action. Could I get that wee one? There's a video on the one with the candle. So that's just pure woad, which you sometimes see in manuscripts, and where people have just mixed woad and gypsum together. And they're not a very satisfying colour, and they're certainly not the quality of Kells. But this is what I think they're doing for Kells, is they're heating it, and they're driving off a water molecule from the gypsum. Then the woad heats up, becomes a gas, and that fixes to the gypsum. So they've essentially invented a synthetic pigment, and that's why it's still stable, because that's the other thing. If you have woad garments and textiles, aren't going to stay blue for that long. But in Book of Kells, Lindisfarne, all the blues, absolutely perfect, and it's because they've converted the indigo into a synthetic pigment. So that's it. That's the original in Kells, and then that's my copy of that. And again, I mean, screens and colours and all that's never that reliable, but you can get the idea of it. And if you see that each of the crosses is a slightly different shade, that's because you have to do it in really, really small batches, and it's very difficult to control the ratios. So that is the sign of that process happening. They are sitting there with a candle, doing a very small batch, doing a section, then cooking up more. And that's because it doesn't work beyond, you know, fractions of a gram, and you just don't get the heat distribution correct. So it has to be something like that, and that's the tell in Kells. Now later in Kells, I think they mix several batches and mix them together, so they take out, they kind of average it, but it looks like, I think this is one of the earlier pages done, and they're still kind of getting into their stride a bit, and that's something they've recalibrated later on, but that's quite diagnostic of that technique. And here's the more typical thing in an early insular gospel book is that they just don't know what to do with woad. So there's somebody literally, they've just got some woad, heard it makes blue, stuck it straight on with no processing. That's a kind of slate grey, and that's what you usually get. So this recipe, even at the time, wasn't very well understood. And yet you see the purples there are great. So that's a lichen purple that looks like it's had an alkaline applied to it. So, you know, they understood acids, bases, the processes of extracting orson with ammonia. They understood all that chemistry. Comes to woad, they don't have a clue. And that's quite normal in manuscripts. Kells, Lindisfarne, and a few others would be the exceptions there, where they really, really know the chemistry. Bit of controversy, and I'm sorry if anybody's seen me talk before, because I always bang on about this one, that I just don't believe in oak gall ink at all. I think it's an absolute load of nonsense. I think it was oak bark ink. And I've had the manuscript tested, so that's this folio, which is done to match the ramen at Trinity. So if you sat with all the lasers, that would come up that this is the Book of Kells, basically. There's no non-invasive test you can do on this that doesn't tell you that this is exactly the same as the Book of Kells. And it's never been anywhere near an oak gall, and it's never needed to be. So there's it getting tested at Durham by Andrew Beebe. There's the graph, and that's exactly the same as an oak gall graph. So basically all the graphs for ramen that tell you that means oak gall ink is in something could equally be telling you that it's oak bark ink, because the technology can't tell the difference. So I can't even remember if that is oak bark or oak gall, but they're all the same. That's the point. So I don't know, and neither does anybody else. And so all things being equal, at least 50% of manuscripts have oak bark ink in them. But the thing is, it's not all equal, because the wasp and the little oak galls didn't arrive till 1835. And if they had sneaked in before that, they couldn't have survived before 1735, because they require the turkey oak as part of their life cycle, which is brought in by Capability Brown. So you can absolutely exclude oak galls from anywhere near any insular monastery. Even the problem that they solve concentrating tannins is an issue in the Levant, where their trees have a much lower tannin content. For our native trees, it's just not a problem. So it wouldn't even be anything they would need to seek out. It just isn't a problem in this country. And a bit of geometry, but not very much. I'm just not there for geometry today. So you can see here, keep it light, but that's the underlying instruction of the Liber page. And what it sort of shows is that the designers of the page want you to know what the geometry is. So if you see that wee star, that sits on the pupil of the wee fella's eye there, and that's quite common in manuscripts. It's a real significant construction line will usually sit on eyes or somewhere in the face or in a gesture. And again, down the side here, that cut into the border, that gives you your ratio. So that tells you what the square is, and then the extra bit, and you can divide those two numbers, and that gives you essentially what the overall geometric proportions are of the entire piece. So because Robert Stevick really did a lot of the research on this, but he kind of stopped with rectangles. But it turns out that when they don't include the rectangle in the final design, they include the clues to what the rectangle is. So it's as if they want you to read the piece geometrically, and that comes across in Pictus stones as well. So if they do anything non-standard, they go out of their way to let you know that it's still geometry, that they're still doing it properly, and that's really, really common. As in Kells, it's just quite an interesting feature of the book that these, seemingly random indents are actually, it's a communication of this geometry for some reason. I have absolutely no idea why. And there's a practical need as well for it. So a great example is all of the incipit letters are pretty much pure geometry. You would never get that many lines together that neatly on those curves without it being compass work. So that's the underdrawn of the S spiral of the Initium page, and it took quite a while to work that out, and I think there's maybe about 100 or so component parts of little arcs that all go together to make that, and it really does have to be absolutely precise. There's no freehand stuff in this at all, because all of those have to join up, and if you look at the original, there's no obvious joining lines at all, yet it's physically impossible to do those arcs in a single sweep. So they are, you know, absolutely precise little components that mean there has to be a geometric underdrawn and everything has to be linked together in a very, very specific way. And that's a video as well. Could I get that one? Yeah, so that's it, a stopgap. But I used to do them as actual films, but I always forgot I was filming because I got so into the geometry, so I just had the back of my own head filmed. So, so that's a stopgap one, so you can actually see what's going on. This is the piece based on that geometry and all the techniques just talked about. And it's all sort of obvious to this audience where I'm stealing from the Book of Kells. But less common stuff I'm ripping off here is all the stuff from Tarbert Discovery Centre. We've got an amazing sculptural collection, most of which hasn't seen the light of day, or it's buried in some very good PhDs. But the interesting thing there is that a lot of the key patterns and knots and things that I'm stealing from Kells are also present on sculpture at Tarbert. So I'd say about half of that is a rip-off of Kells, half of it's a rip-off of Tarbert, and there would be maybe a 25 to 30% is an overlap where you get the same things in both sites. So again, another thing that really ties Tarbert and Kells down to each other. And that's me pretty much done. So are we questions now, or we're doing it at the end?
Okay, we'll do the questions at the end if that's...
All right, I'll just put the sharp bits away so Donka doesn't hurt himself when he's up.
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's fantastic. Great new information and fascinating research and wonderful artworks, and you can see some of those in the gallery. I think we're just going to put the lectern back.
Aye, cheers. I'll just set it down there.
Thank you, Thomas. That was fascinating. And I think there are going to be lots of questions. And we're continuing the Book of Kells theme this morning. There's been quite a lot of mentions of it throughout the conference, but we've now got Donica McGavin, who was also at the 2019 conference in Andover. It's great to meet him there for the first time. And after the conference, I got to see Niagara Falls with him, and Ruth, and Catherine Crowe, and we're missing Catherine this year. Catherine came to talk to us about enamelling from Toronto, and she very kindly gave us a trip up to Niagara Falls and to Toronto. So that was an amazing experience. And I got to spend 2 days in the Royal Ontario Museum. So that was great for me. Downpatrick is from Knockany in Lochgur, and he's been an artist and a teacher. And for 16 years he's been engaged in the study of the Book of Kells. And he's dedicated to communicating research to academic and the wider community about the Book of Kells and his research. He's written a number of publications, and also he has a recent book he's going to show you, tell you about, the Book of Kells, a Masterwork Revealed, Creators, Collaboration and Campaigns. It's quite fascinating, at Sidestone Press 2022. So it's hot off the presses, really. And his talk today is The Book of Kells and Its Artists, Reflections and Reactions. Welcome, Downpatrick.
Thank you, Mike. Gormalga, thank you, Michael. Just take a moment to get set up. But before I even do that, how do you even try to follow what Thomas has just done? That is just incredible. But I'll try. In fact, while I was sitting at the back listening, I said, maybe I should just set an exam for all of you to see how much of that you remember. I've heard that. I've known Thomas now for a few years, and I've heard a lot of that. I'm still just trying to absorb. There is so much knowledge, so much experimental archaeology, I would call it, going on there, and it's just incredible what he's doing. And I doubt, you know, I'm still, as I said, coming to terms with a lot of the techniques and the science and just the practical experiments that he's doing. It's absolutely phenomenal. And of course, we no longer call it the Book of Kells now, it's the Book of Port Mahomack. But there you go, I got that wrong in my title. Now, I'm going to begin actually just to take a few minutes to do a little advertisement. This is, you know, in any good TV program, you have to watch the ads as well. So this is me for the last 16 or 17 years or so. I've lived in the 8th, 9th century, and I'm only coming up for air, in recent times. And this was my work in trying to understand the Book of Kells was just so absorbing and required so much time. I wasn't aware of so much that was going on, in particular the wonderful work of the people who were involved here in the conference, and people like Thomas, and Stephen Walker. Well, I had met Stephen because Stephen was one of those first people who kind of bridged that gap between the maker and the academic world. And Stephen just wows the academic conferences when he presents his work, as Thomas has done. Thomas joined the last conference, academic conference, and has added another dimension to that. And this is wonderful. You have people like in UCD with programs in experimental archaeology, and I think our cattle expert is or was based down there. That Thomas was. It was research. There was a pint of beer as well, but it was research going on there last night. It was phenomenal. And so I just want to very, very briefly tell you about the book. Now you might wonder why I am putting up a little cartoon, another cartoon about miracle. And this is, I'm very delighted to have been able to publish this. Why shouldn't I expect miracles? Well, to get this published by an academic press was a little bit of a miracle. Because it actually exists, you might just kind of take for granted, well, you know, he's a scholar, he did a study, so why wouldn't it be published? And this was my thesis. I was very fortunate to have Michelle Brown. Many of you will have either met or heard of Michelle Brown, just a phenomenal scholar. Michelle Brown turns out books like some of you turn out paintings. I don't know what the count is at this stage, but it's absolutely phenomenal. And around 2015, I had to get my college in London asked me, I needed permission from Trinity College to like most theses now, they go online. And this is what I got. Eventually, it took a while even to get their agreement that this would be published online. They really didn't want this book to be published, and that's why I say it's a little miracle. Actually, it's not a little miracle, it's a big miracle that this book has been published. And I'm emphasizing, it's not that everything in here is right, is correct, is accurate. I hope it makes It's an honest attempt to contribute to scholarship and understanding. And that's all anybody can do in their time. Technologies will change and we'll make those things better in time. But this is one of the reasons why I want to encourage people to pay attention to this. It's not for my sake, it's actually for the sake of scholarship on the Book of Kells and the next generation who will contradict what I'm doing, as Thomas and people like that are doing already. But I've been very fortunate to have had a number of, even though they tried to restrict my publication, lots of people have, I've had access. Some of the one on medieval humour isn't even out just yet. And I've been very, very fortunate, and that's why I'm wearing as well the conference t-shirt from Andover. This is another one of Ed Rooney's designs. And Stephen Walker, of course, as well as being a wonderful jeweller and an academic in his own right as well now from the work he's doing. This is his whole project, the fact that we're here. And it's wonderful that Mike and so on has picked up the baton to carry on that idea. And I'm wearing this t-shirt just as a little way of marking the fact that started in 2019. Well, the first conference, the ideas started long before then. And again, I can't praise Mike enough for the work that he has done here in this absolutely wonderful centre. This is a fabulous venue for this, and the work. Mike, you think it's just all happening, but this is the swan floating across the surface, but the legs are paddling frantically underneath. Mike has done phenomenal work to make all this seem as if it just kind of happens. So this is the book just published in last October, and I'm actually having concentrated on getting that out. There's a number of things that I'm doing. One of them is I'm actually trying to encourage Trinity College to change their attitude and to be more encouraging. This is a recent attitude to be more encouraging of scholars, as I said, for the next generation, and people like Thomas and the scholars that haven't even started studying it yet. And I might, if you want to come up to me at some stage during the day, I'm trying to put together a little petition just to encourage Trinity College that I will send to them. I've made a submission to them already, and I just want to add to that. But don't feel under any pressure, please. And certainly don't do it if you want to potentially have career opportunities in Trinity College. Don't put your name to that. And in any case, you just may be uncomfortable signing something like that, and I understand that. That's absolutely fine. Now, another thing so I just want to tell you about the book. This is the website, the wonderful Sidestone Press in Leiden in the Netherlands, and you can get an ebook copy for €15. You can get a paperback for €60. Now, unfortunately, that's about, if you go to your bookshop, I got a bit of a land when I discovered, I went into my local bookshop in Limerick and said, what would it cost? They said, it was about 70 or more. That's very expensive. If you want a hardback book, it's 120, probably in realistic terms more like 130, but that's academic publishing, unfortunately, phenomenally expensive. But the wonder of Sidestone Press is everything they produce is free to read online. So far, I think it's nearly 360 now, but 353 people since I've published this have downloaded my book. I'm thrilled. I'm jumping up and down. I'm never going to make money out of this. But I do want hard copies to go out into the world. And for the conference here, and I bought a bunch of copies at an author's discount. I'm sticking them into bookshops all over the place. If you want a copy, and it's still very dear, still an expensive book, and this is not the beginner's guide to the Book of Kells. This is serious if you're seriously interested in it. But I'd even encourage people, look, encourage your librarian, encourage your school, your college to get copies. I've been busy trying to get copies into libraries in the Republic, and maybe Mike or somebody here might, they might be saying, okay, let's stick a few copies in so that at least they're available. Now, another thing that I'm doing, so Connor, if you could just stick up that little, another initiative that I'm doing is a website, and I've referenced this in my book, so I wanted to get it up at some level. That's just a still, and Connor, but there's a lovely little animation that I began to design, but then I got a former student of mine to do it. He studied animation, and it's a lovely little bit of fun. But in this, and I'm not going to take you through the website, but I would encourage people just to have a look. So under media, for example, I have all of Kel's initials as they occur sequentially, and this is something like about 4,000 initials. The numbers are phenomenal, but I also have them grouped as A's and B's and C's. So if you're a designer or an artist and you're looking for an A in the Book of Kells, I needed one for my tattoo here, and I used that database that I had built. So and a number of other things that I want to make available, and I hope this might be useful to, if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that little motif playing a little bit more, a little bit larger, and I think it's quite nice what, as I said, this former student of mine did. But, all right. So I hope it'll be a resource. It's only in its infancy. I haven't had time to really get involved in it because I've been too busy with the book. But I want to get back to that in a few months' time and try and build on that. I'm actually going to do every page in the Book of Kells, a translation, the Latin, the translation, talk a little bit, a few sentences about what's interesting or unusual in the Book of Kells. I don't know if anybody will be interested, but then that's enough. One person is enough. Okay, we'll move back to and thank you for your patience with the advertisements. The commercial is over. I'm going to try and get onto the paper. So that's just the title of it. And I want to begin especially by remembering this individual. Megan and others have mentioned Dr. Peter Harbison. He's being cremated just as we speak. Wonderful guy. When I came to all of this, it was really outside of the university. I wasn't in a university. I was a teacher and an artist, and I hadn't a clue what I was doing, hadn't a clue where I was going. One of the first people who was a fantastic mentor for me was Peter Harbison. And I was down at the, I'm just going to get this. I was down at when Mike was giving us that wonderful tour of the museum, and he mentioned that, Peter did this book, The High Crosses and Round Towers of County Down. And I bought this as my little memento mori I didn't buy the High Cross, I'm sorry Mike, my budget is shot. But I bought this just as a little, for me, a very, very poignant memory of Peter. And I discovered a very unusual little connection with my family. I discovered a few years ago that an aunt of mine was a child nurse to Peter and his brother, who was quite well known as well because he was the state pathologist. That's the late John Harbison, was the state pathologist. My aunt used to mind them when they were babies. So anyway, now I'd love to be able to continue by just talking, but if I do, I'm gone over time what I intended to do for this already. It's lovely to hear somebody like Thomas and many of the other speakers who have just spoken. If I don't stick to my script, I will, you won't get lunch. And so in addition to Peter's enduring legacy of wonderful scholarship, he leaves a great legacy of warmth and friendship. And many of you here, or several at least, will have known him. Just a thorough gentleman, a wonderful scholar. So Yeshde Goreva Anam Dealish. Thank you, Peter. Now, for those who are familiar with my work, it won't come as a surprise that I'll be talking about the book of my book, the Book of Kells, otherwise known as formerly known as the Book of Kells. Kells has, of course, inspired many responses from artists over the years, like these, for example, by Margaret Stokes, 140 years ago, or thereabouts, and by this Japanese artist, Mise Tanaka. This, I think, was published in 2009. I'll have her book available. It's almost impossible to get here, but Mise Tanaka, she's about 80. She's just finished the Book of Kells. She's now starting on the Book of Doro. You'll be able to have a look at her book. We exchanged copies of our books there last autumn. An incredible lady. She obviously, you'd imagine she must have an Irish granddad or something. No, she doesn't. This lady has no connection with Ireland, but this is the power of Celtic, of the art that inspires all of us, and certainly the Book of Kells. I'll be making available some work by Barcelona artist calligrapher Josep Batlle in that little exhibition afterwards as well. Again, Josep doesn't have an Irish granny or a granddad. He's not from Newton Ards or from Kells or anywhere like that. Nobody, where he lives, nobody is interested in what he's doing. You know, and this is wonderful. We all beaver away in our own little patches, and this is what's wonderful about this. And the conversations, listening to people over coffee, sharing ideas about key pattern and knitting and whatever it's just fantastic. This is wonderful, and a lot of it happens at 1 o'clock in the morning. You know, some of the important stuff, not here listening to me, but at 1 o'clock in the morning in the pub afterwards. So as I said, in my work, which challenges the received wisdom, the long-held view that Kells was the work of a large team of scribes and artists, I've concluded that it was entirely the work of two individuals, and I call these the master artist and the scribe artist. And as the name suggests, only the latter was responsible for the script, while both were artists. Now, in the paper, I'll begin by taking a brief look at some of the features that distinguish the work of one from the other, and especially in their handling of figures. Now, most of you are kind of into the naughty verse and all of that, and the focus of this is more on the figurative art, which throws up its own sort of issues and questions. And the scribe artist is responsible for most of these in the manuscript, and I'll focus on some of the aspects that are distinctive in his figurative work. At the end of the paper, I'll finish off by having a look at the reactions of some later artists and commentators to such work in Kells. So, to begin then, the master artist, the artist formerly known as the goldsmith. That was the name given to him by the great scholar François-Henri. And Henri identified him as the creator of such masterful pieces as the Cairo page here. And the evidence revealed in my research suggested that he had a greater involvement in the creation of the manuscript, and I devised the name Master Artist to reflect this expanded role. He's an artist that seems most at home working within the repertoire of curvilinear and geometrically based motifs, many of which are found here on the Cairo page or on the so-called 8-circle cross carpet page. And we'll zoom in, I hope you can see that little red outline. We'll zoom in on this disc here at the upper left, and such motifs and this kind of work generally is especially familiar to us from the metalwork of the period. Are you there, Jordan? Right, Jordan has the T-shirt with this always. I think that's the. Probably a good idea. That is the design on your shirt. Yeah. Fabulous. So you can, I mean, you've probably seen these things already anyway. You don't need me to explain that. It speaks for itself. And similarly here on the back of the, that's the Drenor disc, and similarly here on the back of the Tara brooch. And comparisons have often been made between these kinds of work. And who knows, perhaps the master artist's background and training were rooted directly or indirectly within such a metalwork context. The master artist does include some figurative work from time to time, as here on the Cairo page. And this is the head of Christ. Again, can you see those little red outlines? That's the head of Christ at the end of the letter Rho, and I've rotated it for a more normal view. Or here we see some creatures from the Lucan genealogy on folio 30V in Kells. And we see the same precision and fineness that we find in his more geometric work. In terms of the classical tradition, the head of Christ is perhaps the most accomplished human representation in the Book of Kells. The red marks in his hair are, in my opinion, by the scribe artist. If you can see what I'm referring to there, the little red ink additions. And these, along with the simple interlace and stepped patterns, are clearly not as finely rendered as the surrounding motifs. I believe these were added later in what I've identified as a second campaign of work. Only the scribe artist survived at this time to attempt the completion of the manuscript. Attempting to tease out the contributions of both artists in the first campaign and those of the scribe artist in the second campaign has been a painstaking process in my research over the years. The master artist also occasionally incorporates more of the figure, as here on folio 1V in the beginning of the canon tables. And here again another human torso on the last page of Kell's illuminated canon tables on folio 5R. And just see the two together. I think the head of the figure on the left was added by the scribe artist, but otherwise these seem to be the work of the master artist. While neither figure is anatomically perfect, they're both reasonably well proportioned, and I want to draw particular attention to the arms and gripping hands of both figures. The fingers on the hand of the figure on the left are accurately stepped, if you know what I mean by that. And this left hand is holding a book, although that's difficult to see anymore. There's a lot of abrasion on that page. In the figure on the right, the bent arm and gripping hand are also pretty accomplished, even if the arm isn't quite perfectly aligned with the shoulder. So bearing these in mind, let's compare some of the figurative work I've attributed to the scribe artist. Here's a figure from the second page of the canon tables. Another from folio 183R. And a third from folio 187V, that's the final page of Mark's Gospel. Looking at the hands and arms of these figures, we can spot a number of problems. They're all depicted with a right arm, but the gripping hand is the left one in each case. And looking at the figure on the left, if we see the area outlined in red as showing the forearm from the elbow, it then appears to have a second forearm added with the wrong hand. Switching our attention to his legs, we can see the manner in which the right leg is extended upwards. And we can only guess that it would have to be joined to the body somewhere behind the double forearms, but way too high in the figure. The idea of showing the body and limbs beneath the clothing worn by a figure goes back quite a way to the beginnings of classical art, if not even further beyond that. But here's a small bronze statue, probably of a goddess, and her legs are clearly depicted, or at least strongly suggested, beneath her robe. Here's another example, again from ancient Greece. And here on a painted vase from around 490 BCE, and we can see the outline of the woman's legs beneath her, or through her thin dress. In all three cases, the anatomy of the figures is accurate in its literal and visual detail. It's coherent and well realized. Returning to our figures in Kells, we can identify some of the difficulties the scribe artist seems to have had. In the first one, as mentioned, the leg is not connected to the body in a way that makes any anatomical sense. In the middle one, the right leg is much too short and not aligned with the left leg. And if we try to imagine the legs here, in the figure, whoops, sorry, I've just gone too far. In the figure on the right, we quickly realize there's only room for the lower part. They're far too small in proportion to the upper body. And here we can see a simple version of legs shown beneath a robe. This is in the Codex Amiatinus and portrays Ezra, which was probably copied from a Roman model. Even perhaps an image that actually came from Rome. But in general terms, a Roman model, I mean a model that is showing some knowledge of the classical tradition. And the Matthew portrait in the Lindisfarne Gospels seems to have been derived either from the Amiatinus figure, or perhaps they shared the same exemplar, maybe a manuscript that came directly from Rome to Northumbria at that time. And the maker of the Lindisfarne Gospels, Eadfrith, has done a reasonable job in copying it and dealing with the complexities of the human figure. These are less successful, at least in the context of the classical tradition. And I want you turn your attention now to the feet at the bottom of each of these images. Here, they're all rendered in a type derived from classical contrapposto. This is another feature that has its origins in classical art. A contrapposto pose, at its simplest, is a figure standing in a relaxed manner with more weight on one foot. So if I was a soldier standing to attention, I'm like that. If I'm in a contrapposto, which is a normal kind of pose for any human being, if you're standing up, you know, you have more weight on one leg, the other, and then you change it around. That's why you have a bar in a pub, you know, so you can do that. Physically, it's very restful, and it creates a lovely movement through the body and so on. And this is one of the more famous early Greek instances. Here's a well-known statue of Caesar Augustus. And you notice the way they've very, very modestly put the image source there. Not quite so here. You'll all recognize David instantly, Michelangelo's David. This is from the Renaissance, a time when the ancient classical traditions were being revived. When we place the feet of the Kells figures in this context, we can understand the source from which they were derived. Where have I lost my... right. These Kells figures, these ancient feet juxtaposed... No, sorry, I've lost my... These ancient traditions were revived in painting also, pardon me. And here we see Kells' contrapposto feet juxtaposed with another famous Renaissance painting, Botticelli's Primavera. You may know it as the Rite of Spring. And this painting, of course, also incorporates the other classical conventions we've been looking at. In addition to the details of the contrapposto poses, we can recognize the see-through costumes, revealing the limbs beneath, and so on. And I suppose we'd have to admit that the scribe artist doesn't quite achieve the same level of elegance as Botticelli. But of course, this is not what the scribe artist is aiming for, even if he is trying to incorporate some elements of the classical models. Botticelli's image is at an extremely sophisticated end of this classical art, and it's fairer, perhaps, to compare the scribe artist's work with the more contemporary religious art, such as the Ezra figure we saw earlier, Eadfrith's version in the Lindisfarne Gospels, or a one I haven't shown you, this 6th century Byzantine or classically inspired mosaic. This one is in the baptistry of the Arians in Ravenna. Of course, even compared with these, we can identify the challenges facing the scribe artist as he tries to incorporate elements of classical art. And if we'd more time, we could also have considered his struggles in attempting to handle the drapery of the figures. I've suggested that he compensates for his inadequacies by employing a kind of copy and paste approach, using a sort of identikit assortment of parts. This results in his figures looking like they've been assembled from disparate elements, often with little or no sense of how these should be combined and proportioned. His muddled attempts would seem to indicate the absence of any knowledge of anatomy, and one might reasonably assume that this just wasn't part of his artistic training. And similar patterns are identifiable in the scribe artist's treatment of heads. This is the head of Christ from folio 202V, the so-called Temptation page. And I have an idea that the scribe artist may have used the master artist's head of Christ from the Cairo page as a kind of a guide or a model. In comparing the two, we can spot many differences, and one of the most obvious, perhaps, is the size of the eyes. They're much too large on the scribe artist's head on the left. And linked to the eyes and eyebrows, we can see that the nose here is also too big. Another detail is the position of the ear. In the master artist's head, we can see this is reasonably accurate, being opposite the nose, as we all learned maybe if you studied drawing. And the ear on the left, however, is way up here, and it seems to be connected with his hairline. And this is, so in particular, these two aspects, the position of the ear and the combined eyes, nose, mouth grouping of features, became a useful diagnostic in distinguishing the work of the two artists. And I examined all these heads and kells by drawing them, tracing them. And that revealed a formulaic pattern. And this becomes even more apparent when you juxtapose it again with the master artist's head from the Cairo page. You can see he's got the proportions, more accurately and so on. But despite all his shortcomings, do you recognize this? Or classical failings, we can see that the scribe artist's distinctive style was alive and well, as Picasso explored the expressive power of art forms beyond the dominant and classically inspired academic conventions. His revolutionary Les Demoiselles d'Avignon was a deliberately controversial artistic statement. And I just love the way the eyes are kind of doing the same thing in both cases. Now, I'm going to change tack to another. We're leaving all that for the moment. I will come back to a few comments on the scribe artist. Whoops. How am I doing on time, Mike? Am I?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, let's see if we can do this. Right. So this, I want to look at the reactions of some commentators on Kell's figurative art. And the first of these is Christopher de Hamel and his Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts. This publication is itself remarkable, a really wonderful book on manuscripts, and I'd recommend it to anybody. It's wonderful in most respects, I think, that is, with the exception of some of the author's comments on the Book of Kells. In his account of the Kells Virgin and Child page, de Hamel writes that the picture is dreadfully ugly. Mary's head is far too big for her body. She has huge, staring, red-lined eyes and a long nose which looks as though it is dripping downwards, and a tiny mouth. Her pendulous breasts are visible through her purple tunic, and her little legs stick out sideways like a child's drawing. The baby, seen in profile, is grotesque and unadorable, with wild red hair, like seaweed, we've had seaweed already, protruding upturned nose and chin, and a worrying red line from his nose to his ear. And he goes on to say the child has 2 left feet, and Mary has also, but anyway. De Hamel, whoa, how am I gone into that? It's just so good, it keeps popping up. If we can just go back to the PowerPoint again. Sorry, I don't know what maybe I did something there, Connor. And Connor has been brilliant while he's doing that. Hasn't Connor just been fantastic, doing all the sound and the everything? I'm saying that in the hopes that he can put this back on screen again. Okay, you'll have to go down to about 100 now or something like that if you can, because we rejigged the numbers, so if you can just sort of fly. So here you're getting a recap of everything. Now, I hope this will go in as injury time, Mike, in the... Okay, well, yeah, that's good. Okay. Just go back 1 minute. Well, I can take it from there. So the grotesque and unadorable. So now where am I? Yes, de Hamel also states that I'm not qualified to say whether the 4 unpleasant-looking angels are lifelike, but they are certainly anatomically very improbable beneath their weighty garments. And we can certainly see many of the features this is me talking again now. We can certainly see many of the features we looked at earlier, in particular the lower hands of both angels, which seem unconnected to the body, at least not with any sense of anatomical accuracy. And if we move to the angels at the bottom, we can see again the hands, in particular this one here, just doesn't make any sense in relation to how it would connect to the body. It's just kind of stuck on there. So, childish, dreadfully ugly, Unpleasant, grotesque, and unadorable. What then did de Hamel have in mind? Maybe paintings like this one by Caravaggio, where the old and simple peasants are contrasted with the youthful and beautiful young mother holding her naked baby. The low neckline of her dress, perhaps more pleasant and adorable. This, of course, like the following images, simply conforms to the conventions of another era, where Mary is presented as a beautiful young woman and her child may be depicted like any other and even unclothed. She may be shown breastfeeding the infant. She may even begin to engage the viewer, her eyes turning to face directly out of the picture, as we see here again in this famous circular composition by Raphael. And of course, Raphael painted a whole series of these Madonnas, pictures many of which you'll be familiar with from Christmas cards. Very beautiful things. De Hamel's comments seem a little strange, coming as they do from one of the leading manuscript experts in the world. He's brilliant. He isn't lacking in scholarly knowledge. However, he may simply have been playing to the gallery by poking fun at the most treasured art heritage of his neighbours in Ireland. You also get a sense that when reading de Hamel, how de Hamel prefaces his remarks about the Virgin and Child when he states that, "As a result of what I am about to say, I shall probably have my permission to visit the Republic of Ireland revoked forever." And of course, nothing could be further from reality. We can take a joke as well as anything else, but if he is actually serious in his comments, we can understand that his taste in painting just seems to be rather limited. Really needs to get out a bit, take some air, and hopefully become a bit more open and receptive to art that doesn't quite fit his apparently narrow sense of the aesthetic. Rather than banning him from entry to Ireland, we'd welcome him wholeheartedly, endeavour to broaden his artistic horizons, educate him. And this is what happened about 1400 years ago, when many English had left their own country and retired to Ireland. And this is the account written by the first British or English historian, the Venerable Bede, who continues by saying that the Irish welcomed them all greatly, gave them their daily food, provided them with books to read and instruction without asking for payment. They just love what they do. That's why the likes of Thomas and the rest of you share your ideas. We love this stuff and we share it. We don't want any money in return, other than enough to live on. Now, I hasten to add that Christopher de Hamel was very welcoming to me personally in the early days of my thesis research. He was then librarian at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and he facilitated my examination of several original manuscripts. So I'm just poking a little fun back at Christopher here, but I just don't think you should say that stuff. It doesn't make sense, of course, to compare apples with oranges. The Virgin and Child illumination in Kells has much more in common with images like this, an icon from Santa Maria in Trastevere in Rome. And medieval art historian Larry Nees notes that in the religious art of this time, a tendency to reduce or altogether remove action from the image, which conveys the holy figure as if present, perhaps awaiting the beholder's invocation to come alive. And he goes on, it is this frozen quality, often seen in images that, regard as portraits, which is usually meant by the term iconic. And there's little doubt that the formal language of early Christian icons reflects the language of late Roman imagery, formulaic and abjuring naturalism in favour of conveying a higher truth. Now, I'm going to conclude by taking a look at another illumination in Kells and the reaction of another artist to this. We're hopefully racing to the end line. Are we doing okay, Mike? The so-called Arrest of Christ page in the Book of Kells. And you may be aware that the distortions in the I've done it again. Where's Connor? What am I doing, Connor? I do apologise. I'm obviously hitting some button here that's ridiculously... so I might even be able to continue. Oh, great, we're there. Fantastic. Thank you. I'll try and... try not to do that again. So you may be aware that the distortions in the central figure of Christ here have been understood as forming the X-shaped chi of his abbreviated name. And I know Thomas has done some work on this, but we don't have time to go into that now. 1 o'clock tonight. When we look at the attendant figures on either side, we can identify some of the details with which we've become familiar. For example, the contrapposto feet of the figure on the left, and we can also see the poor proportions of the legs as they appear beneath the robes. In both cases, following the upper leg from the bent knee, we can see that the hips are far too low down in relation to the rest of the figure. Now, of special interest here are the hands of these attendants as they grip Christ's arms. And here we see an illustration of this page from a book published in 1868 by Westwood. And you can actually, even though it was published in 1868, there's a modern reprint of that. I was showing it to Thomas, and there are some quite interesting things. If anybody wants to see it afterwards, you're welcome to have a look at that. You can get it for a few quid online, which is nice. That's by John Obadiah Westwood, just a little earlier than the Cairo page by Margaret Stokes that we saw earlier. And like Stokes, Westwood was a prominent scholar of insular manuscripts in the 19th century. But let's look closely at this hand in particular, again outlined in red. In Kells, we can see that instead of gripping Christ's arm, the left hand is shown in front of it. Westwood, or his lithographer, maybe it wasn't Westwood because a lithographer would have had to draw these up on a stone for printing at the time, probably assuming this is an error, has decided that he will improve on the original. And in his drawing, the hand is shown actually gripping the arm of Christ. And this discovery prompts us to look for other discrepancies or corrections. In Westwood's image, we could play a game of spot the difference. We might compare the eyes of the attendant figures and note that they have been reduced in size in Westwood's picture. And Christ's eyes have been modified a bit also. We might also observe that the dangling hand of the figure on the right has been given a bit of an angle, a bit of bone there to make it appear less limp. The distinctive approach devised by the scribe artist, of course, creates an issue for anyone like yourselves, artists, trying to create figurative work in his style. And our visual culture is saturated in photographs or photographically based images, and any art training most of us will likely have had will have incorporated some sense of anatomical accuracy and proportion. Like Westwood, we may be inclined to render things a little bit more accurately, tidy things up a bit. It's difficult, if not impossible, to avoid the consequences of our conditioning. If you've learned to work in a particular way, it's quite hard not to do so. Whatever about copying something faithfully just as it is, and this is important for the artists here, how then does one go about creating new work if you're trying to do it in the style of the scribe artist in Kells? Do you deliberately make it misshapen and whatever? So, just a few concluding remarks. And Mike is being very patient. He hasn't thrown anything at me yet. Over my career as an art teacher, I've known many students who felt they were inadequate in attempting to draw the figure from life. I have a particular memory of twin girls who came from Yorkshire and who briefly attended our school. That's down in County Limerick. And I'll never forget the frustrated comment of one who simply said, "I can't draw, chaps." And I didn't understand what she was saying, first of all, and I'm sure I'm not doing justice to her lovely accent. But I think you get the idea. And some students, of course, don't have these difficulties. For them, drawing figures comes easily, almost intuitively. They don't need much instruction in anatomy and proportion. These appear to come naturally or instinctively. Perhaps this was the case with the master artist. Although his work is not perfect, as we've seen, he seems to have had a better grasp of the classical tradition. The scribe artist, on the other hand, seems to have more in common with my Yorkshire friend. It's as if some people suffer from a kind of mental block. And this is only exacerbated as they look enviously at their classmates' drawings, for whom all this seems to come very easily. And as many of you here are artists, you were probably in the gifted elite side of things. And you know, the teacher wants a poster. Oh, Mary will do the poster. She's good at art. You get that kind of knee-jerk reaction. Oh, sure, I'm hopeless. I wouldn't be able to do anything. And for those who believe they don't possess these natural gifts, if you want to call them that, the I can't draw chaps brigade, this hang-up unfortunately becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy which further undermines their confidence. And I'd find myself having to encourage students to give themselves a chance, not to be defeated by this negative attitude before they even start. So returning to the scribe artist, last few sentences, it's interesting to note that he didn't seem to be bothered by these inhibitions when he was adding figurative terminals, for example, to his initials. In these instances, he's not trying to replicate figures within the classical tradition. He's not burdened by these conventions, and he seems to have thoroughly embraced and enjoyed the freedom of twisting creatures and people into letter forms. What then are we to make of the scribe artist's figurative work on the illuminated pages? Must we consider that this is poor art, childish, and should it be dismissed as unpleasant, ugly, and even grotesque? I believe most people take a more reasonable view. Even when attention is drawn to some of his anatomical inadequacies, I think they and we are all happy to see these features simply as part of the distinctive character and charm of this remarkable work. Just as we must take a different approach if we want to appreciate and understand artists like Picasso and others whose work defies the tyranny of dominant schools, we must be similarly sympathetic to the scribe artist. In my opinion, most people are quite content to do just that, to take such work on its own terms and appreciate it for what it is in its own particular context. Thank you. I hope I didn't destroy your schedule, Mike.
Thank you very much, Donica. Well, great to see so much new research on the Book of Kells. And Thomas, you've helped us reevaluate our perceptions and assumptions about manuscript making. So we're looking forward to quizzing you on that later. And Donica and questioning perceptions of early medieval art, in particular in the Book of Kells. So lots of questions of things that we've maybe taken for granted or haven't really thought about properly. So we're going to have questions at the end of the morning. We're going to have tea and coffee now. We might need to take a little bit longer, but maybe you can come back here at 10 to 12 for Nicola Dixon's talk. Thanks very much.